Hello, everyone. Let's see, move this a bit. Can everyone hear me? Let me know if you can't hear me in the comments. And if the audio quality is just absolutely terrible. But all right, so welcome everyone. We're doing a live stream today about well, I got some very unconstructive criticism, and I decided I could do some constructive things with it. So, okay, let's see. The live counter just started. YouTube live streams are so weird sometimes. Okay. And I didn't get any info from anyone in the chat if they can hear me and if the mic sounds good. The quality of the mic sounds good. So I'll just assume I'll do it based on faith. Okay, here we go. Reality Files says they can hear me. Okay. Thank you for having me check in with the reality. So we're gonna get going here. I wish I could just like smoke a cigarette in here like Andrew Wilson does, but you know, my wife would kill me. Dude, can you imagine how his room must smell? Just like burning cigarettes just constantly while he's streaming. That's insane to me. Anyway, so yeah, what this stream is about, I've wanted to do another live stream or more frequent live streams, and I'm always like in search of topics because it's so hard for me to think of a topic that I'd be willing to cover live that I'm not going to make a whole video about. And so I usually end up focusing on things that are like more topical or things that I just happen to see online, current events or popular figures. And so anyway, I got a lot of attention on a recent post on X that was really just for the listeners of the podcast, basically showing all the books that I'm going to be reading in the following season. And on there I had like Being in Time by Heidegger and the Oedipus plays of Sophocles, so on and so forth. And I got a lot of like comments or like reposts from people who were saying something to the effect of like, I read all these books in 10th grade, or let me look. I actually have one of them here. Somebody says this is the summer of 10th grade Aggies, and someone says, no joke, I read these when I was 16. Men are always behind. So making it like a gender thing. So why did I want to bring this up? Well, for one thing, one of the books that I had on there is this one. So what this is a collection of Nietzsche's lectures on rhetoric and the sophists from his university days. So it's not like in the Nachlass of philosophical writings, unpublished writings. You're not going to find it in Will to Power. It's not like collected. This hasn't been published until recently in English, in an English translation anyway. And so it's like you're telling me in 10th grade, you got a hold of Nietzsche's rhetoric lectures, his lectures on the sophists. Like you read through all of Nietzsche's published works, you read through all of his unpublished works and essays, and then you went ahead and started digging up his lectures. I really believe that. Another one was here, Peter Sloterdijk, a transcription of a lecture that he gave on Nietzsche. Maybe you read that in 10th grade. That wasn't part of my curriculum personally. Another one was like Sun and Steel by Mishima, which is like, we did read some Mishima when I was in college, like Patriotism, but not Sun and Steel. And, I was thinking about it and I'm like, okay, my first reaction to this is, well, that's really stupid. And a lot of you are lying because some of these books are like nothing you would ever read like in your primary education. But then, on another level, I was thinking about it. I'm like, okay, even if this had been like a picture of a bunch of like books from like Lex Friedman's reading list, right? Like I'm like, we're going to read 1984 and we're going to read Brothers Karamazov and all of those books. Even then, I feel like that kind of reaction doesn't make any sense because like, what, do you never reread books that you read when you were a kid? And in fact, you'll probably get a lot more out of those books if you read them when you're an adult and you're at a different place in your life. Like a lot of the classics that, yeah, you read when you're in 10th grade, or what have you, junior year, as we say in America, you will get more out of them when you revisit them as an adult. Like if you're having fun reading these books, if you're getting enjoyment out of reading, and that was my first impression was like, are these people just, is this just the fun police? People don't get enjoyment out of reading the way that I do. And then I was thinking about it a little bit more and I was like, oh, and this is why I wanted to talk about this and why I'm not bringing up any specific person or criticism, because it's not really about the people and it's not really about that criticism. It made me think of what reading really is to a lot of people in, I guess, I don't know what you would say, online spaces, or when people talk about books they're reading, or just intellectual online spaces, philosophy spaces. A lot of people are not doing this for the joy of reading or because they really get something out of discussing these ideas, or because they um you know really like getting into the mind of somebody from a previous era or with a completely different perspective from theirs, or reading fiction that really engages them. They're actually reading because they want to attain some kind of status, or like when they post all of the books that they're reading, it's like a status symbol in a way of like, look at how intellectually elite I am. And another thing might be like, well, now I'm sort of an authority, right? Because I've read all of these books. And you know the thing is, when I was thinking about that, it made me kind of realize that a lot of people would think that that's something that maybe Nietzsche would say, or that Nietzsche would believe, right? Isn't everything all just will to power? So don't aren't you pursuing knowledge so that you can have some sort of status above other people, or some sort of authority or intellectual authority or elitism? And that's why I think it's really useful to read Deleuze, because he zeroes in on this psychological insight that is there in Nietzsche. I think it's one of Deleuze's more legitimate ideas, or legitimate interpretations of Nietzsche. And I have criticized. You can find the podcast that I did with my friend Quinn where we sort of criticized Deleuze. He's not right about everything, but I think he's dead on about this. That being very concerned with such things as your like status as an intellectual elitist is always power viewed from the petty side. It's power in the conception of the slave, as Nietzsche would say, or as Deleuze puts it in more technical terms, power viewed from the perspective of reactivity. The symbols of power, quite literally the symbols of power, right? You're the imagery of like, look at this book that I've read, look at all of they're like notches in your belt, right? Or something of that nature. And it becomes like a symbol or a representation that you can then use to like hold over other people. And it's power seen from the petty side because it's a concern with how you are perceived by them. And your whole action then is reaction, because you're acting, even if you are going and reading the book and accruing the knowledge and going on this literary journey or whatever it might be, you're doing it for ultimately a reactive purpose, which means you're in a sort of reaction to other people. You're doing it for the purpose of, I'm doing this so that then I can be perceived a certain way, which will make me feel a certain way about how I am perceived. And so I just thought that was an interesting insight, because it's one of those really strong claims that Deleuze makes about Nietzsche, or about his work, that when Nietzsche is lamenting that he finds even the highest man human all too human, and that the whole of humanity is like the skin disease of the earth, as Zarathustra says, that what he's talking about, the way in which mankind has been botched by these religions and philosophical movements and so on and so forth over thousands of years, basically all the products of our consciousness, because consciousness has this tendency to be place itself. It is reactive by its very nature. That's sort of the inherent problem. And I won't go into all that because it would take us too far afield. But that really that is the defining thing of humanity. That when we look at the whole history of the human race, it seems like everything, all of our disciplines of knowledge, all of our domains of striving, um, have placed themselves into this sort of like reactive mode of being, if that makes sense. And that's so often when people represent what Nietzsche believed. And I hate I hate to bring this up or this person up because I always do, pretty much every live stream and far too much on the podcast. But Jordan Peterson, like he had a quote recently. Let me see if I can find it actually. Uh, where he was talking to John Vervaeke. I found it. A friend of mine wrote it down, and I actually tweeted this out, so you may have seen it already. But if power, this is quoting Jordan Peterson, if power is the fundamental motivation, then why shouldn't I use my will to power as my fundamental motivation? Or if I do use my will to power as my fundamental motivation, why shouldn't I justify that by the criticism that that is, in fact, once the blinders are off, the central human motivation? And therefore, I'm entirely justified in my attempts, just like all the, quote, great people throughout time, end quote. So the reason why I bring that up is because, for one, there's like a huge just confusion at the root of how he's using will to power. Will to power is definitive of human action in some sense. So he's describing like if will to power is my fundamental motivation. So Jordan Peterson is very much concerned with motives and intentions, which is the stuff of consciousness. So that's already sort of a misread of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche thinks that you're like your motives, your consciousness will give you a post hoc rationalization for your motives, but your motives are, in some sense, just your consciousness rendering an explanation for what your drives or your impulses are already driving at, or what they're already aimed at. So it's already sort of confused. The point is, though, when he's describing it as, why shouldn't I just use my will to power as my fundamental motivation? We can kind of see what he's getting at there. He's saying, okay, if all morality, to translate Petersonian into English, he's saying, if all morality is simply such a post hoc rationalization for what your instincts are already driving at, or so on and so forth, then why isn't it acceptable to simply pursue whatever it is that your instincts tell you to pursue, and say, well, that's my will to power, right? And people often accuse the left of doing that, but you can find it. There's like a really famous quote from Mussolini where he says that if all truth is relative, then fascists then have the right to strive to realize their own subjective truth in the world by any means that they choose, any amount of force or something like that. So there is like a sort of like a right-wing postmodernism that a lot of people don't tend to acknowledge, that if everything is just force, application of force, then morality is a fiction, and justifications are thrown out of the window, then might makes right. And what kind of ideology do we associate that with? It's not typically with the left. So you can use it for either ends, basically. But in any case, I think that's what Jordan's saying, and it's a fair critique, but it's it's perhaps a fair critique of like moral perspectivism or relativism. It's not really a fair critique of the will to power idea, because that, again, is will to power seen from the reactive side, from the petty side. It's will to power seen from, well, if all my motivations are just will to power, why can't I just embrace that? And he's imagining like will to power expressed in these tyrannical or otherwise amoral expressions of power that would end up, harming people or causing injustice, or so on or so forth. So, it, hmm, I'm trying to think of like how to basically like get at this, but the problem with that is that might be included, right? It might be that someone is willing to, cause great harm in order to achieve their goals. But as Kaufman points out in his reading of Nietzsche, the idea, and I talked about this in the Weakness Corrupts video, the idea of wanting to hurt and aiming at hurting people, and because that's always sort of beneath this, right? Sort of this concern that if we embrace total relativity or perspectivism, what about the person that just says, well, this is just my fundamental motivation, I'm going to be sadistic, right? I think what these people usually miss is that I don't know if you've ever stopped anyone from acting in such a sadistic fashion who has a relativistic interpretation of the world by convincing them of absolute morality. That's not usually how we solve that problem in society, even in the modern West, which is supposedly based on principles upheld by reason. Um, that ultimately, when you need to solve the problem of a malicious actor like that, you use force just like any other relativist, right? Um, you don't argue with somebody who's got you at gunpoint, or maybe you do if you don't have a gun and that's your only option to beg for your life. Maybe you're like Woody Harrelson trying to argue your way out of getting shot by Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, right? But again, that never works. And that is sort of the thing, right? That's what Peterson's getting at, is like, what about somebody like Anton Chigurh? That's just his will to power. Like, what are you to say to him? And so I don't know. Just to address that argument, my point would be what you say to that person doesn't matter. It's never really mattered. But the bigger thing is it's not really an argument to be had. He's just betraying himself psychologically, that when he thinks of the will to power, that's what he thinks of, is power seen from the petty side, the side of seeking status, seeking to be above people, seeking to be perceived in a certain way. Whereas the person who is actually truly acting out their will to power, so to speak, which really just means allowing their impulses, which are tyrannical, as Nietzsche says, our instincts are what does he say? He's like the psychology of a human being is always ruled by well, first he starts out talking about philosophers in Beyond Good and Evil, and how they always are ruled by one tyrannical thought, and that on this account the philosopher is really no different from any other sort of human being who always has one dominant impulse, which is driving their actions, right? And if somebody is truly acting in that way, yeah, it might be involved that like there are harms done or something like that, or it might actually be the case where it might benefit a great number of people. But I don't know. There's always a moralist concern with what will it do to others, and what will it do in terms of morality and justice and so on and so forth, if you just live a completely active life, like you have an artistic vision for your life, or a dream or a goal or aim or something like that, that you're willing to sacrifice to and bring forward and be driven by that. They're always concerned of like, what will that do to others? And that then therefore the way that they then perceive acting out your will to power is always in the reactive sense. And so going all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, again, the people who are the fun police about what books you're reading, they're it's because they don't read books for fun. They're looking at it as a power game, and that's not Nietzschean at all, because that's power viewed from the side of reactivity. Um, and so, meanwhile, on this podcast, what we do is we do actually read books to have fun. One of the things that has heartened me and just warmed my heart over the past number of days, especially with the season finale of the podcast and my book coming out and all that, is just the sheer number of people who have written to me saying this podcast has changed my life in some way, or just how they've like written to me with personal stories of like working through hard things or just momentous occasions in their lives, and like I'm there with them, and it's very bizarre. I'm still trying to like process and think through all that and what that really means. But you know, like Goethe's Faust, that's one of the greatest novels. I mean, it's a play, but you know what I mean. One of the greatest works of literature that's ever been written, and it's not widely taught in English speaking like primary education. You'll probably read it in college. A lot of people will, but like when I did the video on Faust, and that was a really popular video, and a lot of people loved it. What they loved about it wasn't that now they can go brag about understanding Faust and getting references from Faust. I mean, maybe some people, maybe that's why. Maybe I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe because humanity is so just reactive in general, that is the experience that many people have. But I would guess given the feedback that a lot of people really enjoyed the story and enjoyed the way I told the story, and that it was like an experience that was like enriching and entertaining. And so I don't know. I think there is something deeply unhealthy about this age of prophilicity, as Hans Georg Muller calls it. And he thinks it's sort of an inevitability that we've moved beyond like the model of self authenticity or what have you, and that we're all concerned with our outward facing profile. That just kind of horrifies me because that's reactivity as a form of identity creation, basically. It's like essentially reactive of basically saying my identity, who I am, is the way that other people perceive me, and therefore to create my identity, I have to create a certain perception. On the other hand, I understand the whole, it is maybe Nietzschean from one angle of the appearance being more real than reality, but um, I don't know. We don't need to go there. Another thing I wanted to talk about. So I also got a comment on YouTube, and I won't say which video because again, this isn't about like calling out a critic or beefing with somebody, and it's also some random account that nobody knows who this person is. So that would be really unfair of me. But again, very unconstructive criticism. It it also relates to Jordan Peterson, unfortunately. Um, I say unfortunately because it's like I actually don't have any beef with the guy. I don't hate the guy, right? But again, unconstructive criticism that we're going to use for constructive means. So basically, this is what this person said to me. They said that uh, Nietzsche never argues that a value is bad due to its source being Christianity, or that a value needs to be overcome due to being a Christian value. Truth is a Christian value and a Nietzschean value, for example. So, and that's one of those things that to me, when I read a little paragraph like that, it's immediately obvious to me what's wrong with it and their thinking. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it might not be immediately obvious to everyone. But it showed that kind of thinking of, is the value bad because it comes from Christianity and its origin, or is it bad sort of independently and Christianity just happens to hold this value? So let's go to first in answering this. Let's go to Antichrist, section 2. Quote, "What is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war. Not virtue, but efficiency. Virtue in the Renaissance sense, virtu, virtue free of moral acid. The weak and the botched shall perish. First principle of our charity, and one should help them to it. What is more harmful than any vice? Practical sympathy for the botched and the weak. Christianity." End quote. So, in that passage, Nietzsche has essentially defined vice, what is bad in his new system of morality, his new system of morals, because the Antichrist is supposed to be book one of the revaluation of values. So, in order to affect that revaluation, you have to first overthrow or have a revolution against the old values. And so that's why the Antichrist is the first book. Basically, the lion laying waste to the old values so that the new things can grow. They can become the child's playground, right? To use Zarathustra's metaphor there. So the idea that you know values come from Christianity, or that you could have a value that happens to be Christian but isn't Christian in its essence, or something like that. Those are the kind of premises underlying that argument, but it completely misses the fact that Nietzsche argues the very origin of Christianity is value judgments. So Christianity is created when the slave moralist, as Nietzsche says in the genealogy, when the slave morality driven by ressentiment turns inward and becomes creative. And that initially the slave morality defines what is good and evil, or rather it begins with evil and then comes to idea of the good. It defines what's evil by what is outside, what is other, primarily what is harmful to me, and people in my in group. What is good is the harmless man, the person that I don't have to fear, or the thing, the person, thing, or object, or whatever that I don't have to fear, or that helps me, something like that, is good as a secondary consideration. But the primary consideration is what is evil. And what is evil is anything that could do me harm, anything that's other and against and oppositional to me. Uh, and so when does that ressentiment turn inward and become creative? That's when it creates the bad conscience, guilt. And that essentially, under the tutelage of the priestly classes, priestly castes, who are sort of competing aristocracy with the warrior aristocracies of the ancient world, what happens is that all of that pent up energy that the slave moralist classes of people have, that they might have attempted to discharge in some fashion, because and it can't just sort of stay idle, because as Nietzsche says, ressentiment is like an explosive material almost. It's very dangerous for it to be pent up like that. And so the priest teaches you to internalize, to take that outward, what, ressentiment would like to express itself as an outward directed cruelty. And the priest takes that and directs the cruelty back in. And that's what's called the dismal workshop, basically. And so there's this whole progression that Nietzsche lays out, right? That you initially have ressentiment, and then that is sort of harnessed by the priestly classes. They use pity. Pity is sort of the intermediary in creating ressentiment, between ressentiment and the creation of guilt, right? Because pity is like the knife thrust into the heart of the strong or the well turned out, on wielded by the priest or by the dialectician, or so on and so forth. Pity is the thing, as Nietzsche says, suffering with Mitleid or Mitleid. I'm sorry, my pronunciation of foreign languages is very bad. Sometimes my pronunciation of English is very bad. But that means suffering with, excuse me. We get it in compassion in English, compati, which means com, with, like etymological root of words like comrade or compatriot, and pati, which comes from like passion, like Christ's passion. So suffering with, and pity in German, Mitleid, literally means that. And Nietzsche, the term for conscience in German as well, and I don't remember the word, it escapes me. Some people will probably type it into the comments, but it means something like the bite, like there's like a term for like the sting or the bite of the conscience. And so that has like a very interesting, like, sort of analogical or metaphorical meaning when it comes to the passage, the adder's bite in Zarathustra, or the vision in the riddle where the shepherd bites through the snake. And so, in any case, so pity has that quality, right? It bites you, it stings you. That's what the sting of conscience is you internalizing the values of pity, which, what do? They multiply suffering, because, I'm suffering, you feel pity for me, now you're suffering with me. What has actually happened? We've increased the sum total of suffering in the world. And what Nietzsche argues that this does, or that the effect that this has by Christianity spreading these pity-based value system around, is that ultimately life becomes less appealing. So, and we didn't really talk about the master morality. I mean, I've made videos on all of this, and I'm kind of assuming that if you're watching this, you're familiar with all of these core concepts. But if you go back to the master morality, part of the core assumptions underlying that are that, like, life is good, and or that life is worth living, or that the things of life are worth struggling for, fighting for, striving for. And things like love and passion and even combat and things like that are good things fundamentally. And that the pity-based morality of Christianity basically creates this sting of conscience, causes everyone to basically devalue life. The highest values devalue themselves, seeing how the world is less and less appealing the more you're aware of and guilty for, that's the important point, all of the suffering in the world. And imagining, you're not actually feeling it, but you're imagining it, and you're taking on all the suffering of the world into your consciousness, which is just, an abstraction. It's just an intermediary representation in your imagination. But you're taking all of that in, and then the whole world begins to look less appealing. And then you get to people like Schopenhauer basically say, yeah, when we consider all the sum total of suffering of the world, it would be better if there was as little life on Earth as there is on the moon, or if the Earth was as little capable of bringing forward life as the moon is, right? That would have been much better. And there are quite a few number of people who believe that today, who don't have sophisticated German idealist metaphysics of the will, people like David Benatar, who will, from like a strictly utilitarian standpoint, say that. And so that's a key point, right? What Nietzsche actually argues then, therefore, is that the ascetic ideal, the idea of the saint, that idea of the saintly life as the highest form of life, which is a way of life which is totally in denial of the world, the physical world, the material world, the world of desire and earthly ambition, completely in rejection of that. That is the final end of this whole progression, this whole logic of development of Christianity. But where does it start? It starts from values. It starts from an essential valuation of the slave morality, evaluating what is outside and harmful to me as bad or evil, and then what's harmless as good. And every other part of that, and there's value judgments along every one of those steps, right? But each one of them is based on that initial value judgment. And so what is Christianity? Christianity is essentially a value judgment that says no to a series of worldly things. It's not as if Christianity exists in some platonic sense apart from these value judgments. Those value judgments are Christianity. Christianity is the form that those value judgments take when they are idealized into a worldview. And so the whole idea that you could have, is a value bad because it comes from Christianity, or does it come from Christianity because it's bad? Well, as we saw when we looked at the passage in the Antichrist, Christianity is defined as what is bad because Christianity, as Nietzsche understands it, you might disagree with everything that I've said in this podcast, but if we're talking about what Nietzsche said, that is what he argues, that essentially what matters about Christianity is the values that it is meant to transmit. And all of the, you go to church and the architecture and the hymns and the robes and the incense and the prayers and the words and the superstitions and the myths are ultimately, those are like aesthetic seductions to a series of value judgments that Christianity is trying to continue on. And the problem is that even as God dies and mythologically we lose many of the metaphysical comforts that Christianity provided, that moral content of Christianity will continue on. And, so perhaps that's something that many people miss about Nietzsche, that it's sort of nonsensical to talk about like, well, is that value bad because of its origin or its function? I mean, for one, just to take another step back, Nietzsche doesn't say values are bad. What he does say is that, he might say that those Christian values are bad because it leads to life denial. And then you might say, well, why is life denial bad? And Nietzsche says straight out in Twilight of Idols, whether someone says life is good or life is bad, that's like an arbitrary physiological expression of who they are. It has nothing to do with, he says that you cannot, a living man can't logically determine, or he can't rule in the case basically because he's an interested party, is what he says. So he's making sort of a joke about like, imagine you're the judge of a trial. You have to recuse yourself from judging whether life is good or not as a living person, because, how could you be objective about it? And he says a dead man can't judge for other reasons. But point being, the actual substance is that values are, as he defines them in Beyond Good and Evil, a physiological demand for the preservation of a certain way of life. Values are their instinct in some sense. They're the brute axiom that you have to accept in order to reason at all. And, in a way you might just say that's a restatement of the ought and is thing. Maybe so. I've yet to see anyone deal with the ought is problem though. So I'm satisfied with that. That's fine. We're in good company. We're in good company with David Hume. And so those were just two instances of what I thought were fairly on their face stupid criticisms, but uh, they actually made me think. So maybe they weren't so stupid. Maybe they were good. But it was I know that the motivations of the people involved who were actually making the criticisms were not good, which is why I'm not making it about them. It's an opportunity to talk about some more ideas. So with that, let's just interact with the audience and have some question and answer. And somebody gave me a super chat, so I'm gonna skip over everything else and go to that first. Uh, this is Mo Jahangard. He says, "Hello, sir. Have you read anything by Leo Strauss, including his study on Nietzsche?" No, I have not. I have listened to his lectures on Beyond Good and Evil, which is a long, long, long series. But yeah, there's recordings of his lectures. It's like an 8 or 9 part. He might do one for every book. It's been a long time since I've actually sat down and read those. And then I've read like some things about Strauss, and I'm familiar with Strauss because I'm somewhat familiar with James Burnham, who's sort of in that same uh, school of, I don't know, neo Trotskyist, proto neocon type people, right? And so that I think both of them have somewhat they have a somewhat similar assessment of the what would you say, like the fundamental problem of liberalism, which is, as we mentioned before, the highest values devalue themselves. The values of liberalism have a tendency over time to pose a threat to liberality. And actually, as I recall, Strauss's problem was also that, um, to put it in really vulgar terms, that basically Western liberal democracies are very bad at defending themselves ideologically from like communism and fascism and theocracy. Basically, these systems of thinking or political thinking or political ideology where there is a well articulated vision for how society ought to be. That these, you could say that in many ways, communism and fascism and like authoritarian regimes are platonic, right? They have a platonic ideal of how society ought to be. And that can be very, I don't want to say motivating, but it's like very anchoring for people of like understanding what that ideal is and what it's supposed to be. And you could argue, well, they never realized that ideal. Whereas, maybe the advantage of liberalism and capitalism, which is also its disadvantage, is that we sort of don't promise you anything, right? Well, when it comes to capitalism, Adam Smith did say, like very early days, like one of the earliest theories of capitalism, that um, uh, he believed that if you allowed the free market to act according to market principles, you will actually get a fairly equal society. Like it's not going to be perfectly equal, but that the natural sort of natural homeostasis will emerge from uh, things that and Jordan Peterson talks about, like that most family fortunes are squandered within a few generations, right? Now, is that true? I think big picture, it's actually probably not true, because who cares about family fortunes? Families are not the main unit of competition in capitalism. The corporation is the main unit. That's what holds the power, right? Or that's like, how do I put this? So there are individual phenomena in the world that are like the way that we assess whether a phenomena is like singular or collective, or like the scale at which to understand a phenomena, is really like how much power it has, if that makes sense. And that might be kind of vague, but there's like a really easy example. And I think this is really useful for getting this across to people who are maybe more individualist leaning, who will say things like, well, the state isn't even real, right? Or like these collectives are all just sort of made up, but the individual is always real. And what I would say is, if you're fighting on a battlefield, are you fighting just like individual enemy soldiers, or are you fighting an army, right? Because do you perceive this phenomena as just a bunch of individuals with their own motivations who are there independently? Well, you could perceive them that way, but that would be a very bad way to perceive them in order to fight wars, because the whole power of a military is coordination and the fact the ability to like bring that collective power to bear. And so in the same way that if you're getting hit by like a tidal wave and you don't see trillions of water molecules, what you perceive is a wave, even though that wave isn't like one thing. It's like think about Heraclitus here, right? One doesn't get hit by the same tidal wave twice. And so in that same way, you know, collective power is very real. And the way that like people often conceive of capitalist competition is as if it's just like a bunch of individuals doing a trading game in a marketplace. But a corporate entity survives beyond any one person or any one family, and has its own internal logic that it will operate according to, independently of like the feelings or beliefs of the people running it. Now, is that always true? Like there can be strong CEOs and weak CEOs, right? If you have a strong CEO, like it really did matter at Twitter, formerly Twitter, when Elon Musk took over it, because if you probably, if you were working there then, you probably don't have a job now, right? Most likely. So that did have like a huge impact on how the company was run. But a lot of the time, but even with something like Twitter and Elon Musk, there still is like an essential function to the platform, if that makes sense. Like maybe this would be easier by like looking at another industry, but if I'm running like a mechanic shop, there's just a certain logic to being like a good car mechanic that's independent of my own beliefs and how I run things, that if you vary from that too far, then suddenly you're not going to be competitive, right? I think this is all pretty basic, but it's just amazing to me, especially in America, the number of people who don't like get this, that we don't live in a world where there's like, or that we don't live in a system where there are like just individuals or even individual families competing with each other. Like that's not real. That isn't the relative or the relevant frame of perception to look at it. So yeah. Okay, so let's look at some more comments and questions. I'm just gonna like, I guess, go backwards to in the chat to see if we got any good. Okay, here we go. Here's a good one. What made Nietzsche and his personal life psychology aware of the anti-worldly view and its problems? That's actually very tough to answer. I mean, I don't know what made him aware of that, of the problems with the anti-worldly view. It's just that Nietzsche, as I've often argued, what makes Nietzsche so remarkable is that in his sickness, he creates a philosophy of health. And as a person who felt that he was destined to die young and probably die an agonizing death based on how his father died, and the fact that he probably had a heritable condition from him, this is still a man who loves life so much that he creates a philosophy of affirming life. But I think it would maybe an easy way to get at this would be looking at Schopenhauer. The real value of Schopenhauer to Nietzsche is that Schopenhauer presents the ascetic ideal, but he doesn't do it within any sort of religious framework or within any sort of set of dogmas or doctrines or like orthodoxies that he has to proclaim, right? Like Schopenhauer is not like a Christian philosopher. He's not a Muslim philosopher or a Buddhist philosopher, even though he's really influenced by Buddhism. Schopenhauer basically tries to find and distill whatever the truth is from all of those different traditions, wherever you can find it. Although he does say in Islam, he has not found one single idea of any value or worth, which is kind of funny. And I'm kind of surprised that Schopenhauer didn't find that. It's another thing where he's kind of opposite Nietzsche too, because Nietzsche says that the Christian knights who were like fighting the Reconquista for Spain to take it back from the Muslims should have groveled in the dust before a more life-affirming religion like Islam. So that's kind of funny. But so Schopenhauer presents the ascetic ideal. He says that the secret goal of all religions is nothingness, the void, and that the path to it is the ascetic ideal. But just the very fact that he's able to like distill down the ascetic ideal, and that he's not specifically talking about an arahant or a Christian saint or a fakir or a yogi, right? He's talking about, okay, there is this goal that we can arrive at by logic, that all these religions have sort of gotten to by revelation and tradition and myth. And so that's Schopenhauer. So Nietzsche reached Schopenhauer at a young age, and he does so when he's like newly converted to atheism. So and the whole thing about that, it's interesting because one of the first people that Nietzsche criticizes is David Strauss in his Untimely Meditation. David Strauss, confessor and something, I forget the full title. But Nietzsche read David Strauss's book when he was a young man, and that was like, Nietzsche was a fedora wearing new atheist, like kid with a super Christian upbringing, who goes off to school, reads in this atheist book by David Strauss, and it's like his God delusion. And when he goes home, he's like, I'm not taking communion anymore, Mom. I'm done. I don't believe in this. Right. And then he shortly thereafter, when he goes to Schulpforta, he meets Paul Deussen, who becomes a good friend of his, who's a Schopenhauerian. He discovers world as will and representation in the library. And so, like, in his atheism, he finds Schopenhauer. So he's had his own religious sort of like dogmatism stripped away, and then he finds Schopenhauer, who's a guy who's stripped away all the religious dogmatism, but he's still committed to the values of the religion, right? He's just trying to render them in like a purely logical form. And I think so that would be maybe the answer to the question, is that in looking at Schopenhauer and comprehending what Schopenhauer had done, Nietzsche sees, and then he then looks at what Schopenhauer said and sort of compares it to the history of philosophy, and he comes to the conclusion that in the long line of philosophers that have existed, when it comes to the question, is life worth living, most of them have said no, if not almost all of them. And this even is true of like most of the pre-Platonics or the pre-Socratics, right? Who Nietzsche has a lot of praise for or admiration for, and thinks are doing something fundamentally more like purely philosophy and more like true philosophy than anything Plato did. But instead of, but other than Heraclitus, most of them come to the conclusion that life isn't worth living. Anaximander comes to the conclusion life is not worth living. Empedocles is, walking around saying, like, when he awoke in this unfamiliar land, meaning Earth, because he's really a god incarnated in human form, Empedocles says, I wept when I realized I'd been born into this unfamiliar land, this foreign land. So, going all the way back to the very birth of philosophy, philosophers have said life is not really worth living. And I think maybe Nietzsche understood that in perceiving that Schopenhauer's value judgments were like the distillation of the value judgments of all philosophy. And I know I'm kind of like blending philosophy and religion here, but Nietzsche says the philosophers up until me meaning Nietzsche, have been a subspecies of priest in so many words. They've just logicized the value judgments of the priest or the common people, so on and so forth. Okay. This is the next person. Yeah, go ahead and tag me if you want me to answer your question. And that doesn't mean I will do it. It has to be a good question. And see, that's not even a question. He just says, hey, your videos are the best. Well, thank you. So, yeah. Let's see if we have another one here. It's the difference between Schopenhauer and Boomhauer. They're both speaking gibberish. Good point. Yeah, that's true. Okay, Jabran Ali Babri says, hey, Essential, would you be interested in how Nietzsche's points are especially alive in psychology? Well, yeah. I mean, I would say that they are. I mean, at the very least, okay, there's maybe one of the big ones would be like epigenetics and the understanding that you might have a like predisposition to certain talents or skills or even like knowledge that can be like turned on by being put into certain environments and circumstances. We might just say that broadly, uh, Freud and Jung brought into brought into empirical research. Um, you know, I'm totally saying this in such a weird way. Freud and Jung, by sort of creating the psychoanalytic school, take psychology from being something that in Nietzsche's time is like just something people do speculatively, like philosophy, and they start doing it empirically, right? So uh, they continue on his ideas of the unconscious, which is incredibly important. And in spite of whatever people might say about Freud or Jung, I think the idea of there being unconscious contents of the psyche and motivations that you have that you're not aware of, drives, things of that nature, pretty uncontroversial in psychology today. So yeah. Okay. Question. I'm doing research for my book. In your professional opinion, how many penises does Cerberus have? One or three? It's obviously one. Al Ohm. Internal family systems is Jungian psychology without the religion, and thus Nietzsche via the back door. Missing pieces, obviously. I don't really know what that means. Okay, and Gibran says, I'm a Nietzschean therapist. It runs deep, such as the definition of narcissistic personality disorder and its treatment. Okay, interesting. I think I've actually like dealt with somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, not in real life, actually online. There's a really um, I wouldn't say famous, maybe infamous member of the Zen subreddit who is I would say he has NPD. I think so. Um, he's like sort of like taken over the entire subreddit and is basically like the center of all the attention because he like trolls voraciously. He he excuse me, he sort of has the sanction of the moderators to make every conversation about him, and does like engages in really like immoral and unethical like character attacks and people, and seemingly has no compunction about lying and all of that. And like I don't know, I'm like dredging up like old that is actually a legitimate beef I had when I was practicing Zen Buddhism. But it wasn't just me. It was like there was a whole divide in the subreddit of people being like, dude, this guy is mentally ill. Like he's sick and he's getting like a sick pleasure out of like dominating this whole conversation, making everything about him. And he kind of created a little personality cult around himself. When did you first encounter Nietzsche, and what was your first immediate impressions? I've talked about this a lot. You could where have I talked about it? I've talked about it in a lot of Q&As. I mean, the first thing I read by Nietzsche was, I think it was The Antichrist, actually. And that was, I was like 17, 18. It didn't make any sense. I was reading a bunch of fedora wearing atheist stuff, and I was like, ooh, The Antichrist by Nietzsche. This is going to be some anti-Christian philosophy. And I pick it up and I read it. I'm like, and he's like, let us look each other in the face. We are Hyperboreans. And I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? I have no idea what any of this is about. And then, I tried to read like Beyond Good and Evil and Zarathustra, and none of it made any sense to me. And then in college, we discussed Genealogy of Morals, and that was the first thing that I had read by him that actually like made sense. I didn't fully get it at the time, but some of the basic premises made sense on a very intuitive level. It wasn't really until I was in my like mid 20s and I went back and reread Beyond Good and Evil, and that was where I was like, oh, and I had like mini light bulb moments reading that book. And it's one of my favorite books still. And then Birth of Tragedy I read shortly after that, which is sort of an unusual choice to follow up on, but it was very interesting to me as a musician. And again, I was reading all this while I was out on tour, so it was particularly interesting. especially the sort of like Apollinian Dionysian thing. Okay. Stojan says, why did you decide to make podcast exclusively on Nietzsche? Are there other philosophers or thinkers that you admire as much and would do multiple episodes and focus on? I mean, I have done that. The top 5 videos on this channel, like one of them is about Nietzsche. I think it's like the one on Faust, Schopenhauer, Plato's Symposium, and there's another one that's not it's not primarily about Nietzsche. So yeah, like yeah, of course. And I'm going to branch out more and more and more. The point of starting everything exclusively on Nietzsche, I mean, maybe this will be some good advice. Actually, okay, so I haven't done much talking about why I make such good podcasts. I guess I would say the whole stream has been an example of that, my good friends. But no, to be serious, here's some actual advice on how to make a good podcast. Have a focus. And I knew if I just start Keegan's philosophy podcast, no one will give a shit about that. Because why? I mean, there's a million of those just generally focusing on philosophy. I wanted to have something that I knew really, really, really well. So that's one thing. If you're going to start a podcast or a YouTube channel, you should really love the thing that you're going to talk about or the subject of it. And that might seem obvious, but I mean, really love it. Like, love it so much that you're willing to spend hours and hours and hours of your life every week and every month doing it. Because, and so with Nietzsche, so I knew I had a really, a decent command of Nietzsche I had done a couple book clubs like on, over the course of COVID. I had joined like a Nietzschean server, and we had a weekly book club where we would get together and talk about Beyond Good and Evil. I think we did first, and people would tell me, "Hey, you explain this very well. You have a really good voice. You should start a podcast." Right. So I kind of knew I had that aptitude from that, but more than that, it's like I felt so comfortable with the material from just focusing just on this. And I knew that Nietzsche had written so much stuff that I could cover like a wide berth with it. And then you can use Nietzsche to sort of like branch out from there because Nietzsche has influences and then he has people that he influenced. So really, I've always wanted to talk about just the entirety of philosophy, but it's better to like anchor yourself in something and center your focus on something because yeah, you can always branch out. But if you start like really nebulously, because you're like, well, I don't want to limit myself, and you make the topic super nebulous, like it's going to be really hard to get people's attention because it's just too general, right? People are looking for generally, sorry, it's a confusing way to put it. Usually people are looking for some specific thing that they're interested in. And I'd also just noticed that at that time, 3 years ago, and the situation's probably pretty similar now, but it's a little bit better. A lot of the content on Nietzsche that I found when I would like look up for basic explainers about Nietzsche was just wrong. Or people were still like peddling in these like ridiculous myths about him hugging a horse as he collapsed or having syphilis or Nietzsche was a nihilist or Nietzsche had sex with his sister or Nietzsche never had any friends, or every woman that Nietzsche, rejected Nietzsche. Uh, Literally every single one of those things is false. So if you think any one of those is true, that's wrong. That's just not correct. And people are still out there repeating a lot of this, but more than anything, like just the misrepresentations of his ideas. And that's why I've been in this fucking stupid dialectic with Jordan Peterson this whole time, because he's one of the people that I just hear people parrot over and over again, where they've never read a book by Nietzsche, but they think they know what Nietzsche said because they heard it from this authority figure who is giving an interpretation that's not right. And it happens from the left-wing side too. I mentioned Deleuze earlier. There are people, especially in the Nietzsche subreddit, where they'll just say certain turns of phrase, and I'm like kind of looking at them, the side eye, like, Is this actually your opinion, or are you just repeating what Deleuze said? And so that happens so often. And so I wanted to just do something where I got into the guts of this stuff, into the source material, the primary sources, and just go in and say, what did Nietzsche actually say? And let's look at it extensively. If we're going to talk about a Nietzsche idea, let's talk about it comprehensively, right? Not just one place where it appears in his work. How does this idea develop across all of his work? And, I got like 96 episodes out of that. Granted, covering other thinkers as well. And so in the future, still Nietzsche is still the anchor. It's still the center. But the next round of episodes, the next season of episodes that I'm going to make is going to be much more varied and much more kind of all over the place. It's all still like related or Nietzsche adjacent or inspired by Nietzsche or an influence on Nietzsche. But I'm kind of branching out more, and I don't feel the need to have to justify the inclusion of other thinkers as much, because I've already introduced them and explained their relation to Nietzsche in many cases. So if I do another Jung episode, I don't need to like devote 10 to 15 minutes to explaining Jung's connection to Nietzsche. I did a whole hour and a half on this is Jung's take on Nietzsche, and this is how they relate. So that's out of the way. It's done. And now I can just talk about Jung. So there will be a lot more of that. Jimothy says, do you think, based on previous Q&A, to apply Nietzsche to modern life, but it seems primarily as a starting point? Would you agree? The grammar of this sentence is making it very hard for me to understand. Based on previous Q&A, apply Nietzsche to modern life. Oh, it seems hard to apply Nietzsche to modern life, but it seems primarily as a starting point. Apply Nietzsche to modern life. Let me think about that for a second. Okay, so I would say this. I think quite a few people are attracted to Nietzsche precisely because they live in modern life, and Nietzsche offers us a glimpse into a world that doesn't, that is beyond modernity, either because he's speaking about methods of moral valuation or religious belief or worldviews that are prior to modernity, or because he's sort of, his free spirits are people who are untimely. What does that mean? You're not right at home in modernity. So in a way, applying Nietzsche to modern life, I mean, what does that mean? I mean, one could say that Nietzsche is writing precisely for the modern person who feels alienated from modernity and knows he does not have the option to live within any life other than the modern. And so Nietzsche, therefore, is, like Zarathustra says to his followers, so let me tell you the truth. Let me tell you the truth about life and nature that is behind the lying, timid morality that you're being fed, and do with that what you will, right? And no matter what, you will do with that as you will. You will become who you are, or you will live your best life, or die trying. Okay, let's see here. Essential Salts, what's your favorite aphorism? Well, it's the first one I ever covered. How the true world finally became a fable. The history of an error. Other than that, I really like The Genius of the Heart and The Genius of the Species. Those three together present like a really, I don't know. I think that's like a very beautiful presentation of Nietzsche. There's also a couple from the Gay Science that I always go back to. There's For the New Year and In Media Vita. So there's 5. There are my 5 favorite aphorisms, but my favorite is probably got to be How the True World Finally Became a Fable. Okay. Nikitaro Yamaoto says, hi, can you explain what did Nietzsche mean by saying that man is a bridge and Übermensch is a meaning of the earth? What does it mean that man is supposed to sacrifice himself for the Übermensch? Well, I mean, he shows you in terms of an allegory at the beginning of the story, when Zarathustra is speaking, and then the rope dancer, as he's called in German, goes out onto the tightrope to walk across. So man is this rope stretched across an abyss, right? Man is a bridge and not a goal. So you have this fool, or not this fool, this rope dancer. So this performer, uh, this person who is trying to cross over from one side to another, walking a fine line on this tightrope. And what happens is the fool comes out behind him, tries to leap over him, and while being distracted by this, or shocked or scared by this, he loses his balance and falls to his death. And then Zarathustra comforts him by saying, for one, don't worry about heaven and hell and moral judgment. So, like Zarathustra's message to somebody who has sacrificed themselves in the act of trying to go over to the other side, and interestingly, an interesting detail is that the reason why he fails to cross to the other side is because he's distracted by a fool who's trying to overleap man as he is now. And that there is a really interesting sort of commentary there about the people who think they can like go beyond their humanity in the here and now, that think they're not human all too human, right? Uh, and it's sort of like trying to, I don't know what, like live in a way that isn't contingent upon who and what you are, like the values that you hold and the environment you're in, and the kind of person you were brought up to be, and um, all of these things that, as Nietzsche says, every single event that creates who you are is necessary. If you've said yes to one aspect of your life, then you've said yes to all of it. You can't take yourself out of your context, out of your perspective, out of your time and place, and like hold the view from nowhere. Nietzsche doesn't believe that, right? He's a perspectivist. So there is like sort of a farcical or buffoonish or foolish element about saying like, well, I can just leap over to the other side, right? Well, that attitude basically disrupts and prevents the crossing. But that's not a bad thing. Nietzsche says that, the vast, vast, vast majority of people who have a chance at becoming great, for whatever that might mean, we're going to leave it undefined for right now, will end up destroyed, botched, so on and so forth, because nature squanders. Nature is wasteful. Nature uh, doesn't care. She's indifferent to her children. And so, there will be a million Raphaels, but most of them are born without hands, right? To put it in that metaphor I've now reused a bunch of times, but it gets the point across that there's only so many, there might have been a million people with the ability to become Raphael, but only one person was in the right time at the right place with everything lining up, that he didn't, he didn't get an arm hacked off in battle. He didn't get bubonic plague and die when he was 13. There's an infinite number of things that can happen that can prevent you from becoming who you are. And you could say, I guess, that then that wasn't who they were, but reaching what your full potential might be if that thing didn't happen, right? And that's almost assured to happen. And the last thing that Zarathustra has to overcome in the story is his pity for the higher man, the potentially higher man, saying, no, nature is squandering, and this is a good process. Ultimately, life is good. That's the tragedy of life. That's the nature of Greek tragedy, is that the individual who is excellent, who is great, who is someone like Oedipus, who's a great hero, discovers that he is ultimately the product of an impious and horrific sort of crime against nature in some sense, and is destroyed by this. Stabs his eyes out, is no longer king, and dies in seclusion. That's what's going to happen to the hero, right? And as who is it? Is it Sallust who says that? I'm trying to think of the quote. Let me find it actually. The cowardly man thinks he'll live forever if he keeps away from fighting, but old age won't grant him a truce, even if spears spare him. So nobody gets out of life alive. So you're going to be sacrificed for something, right? Sacrifice. Your life, nature produces children that are then consumed in this samsaric meat grinder. So it's not an option to preserve your life forever. I mean, if you want that, you can believe in Christian metaphysics. But here in reality, in the phenomenal world, we understand that that's the nature of life is to be that the point of life, if there is a point, is not found in any the preservation of any one individual. And so the meaning of man as a bridge and the Ubermensch as the meaning of the earth is excuse me, sorry. I'm trying not to burp into the microphone. That the what would you say? I'm trying to think of the most elegant way to say this. That we in the now that God is dead and we no longer have that heavenly meaning, that heavenly story in order to contextualize and justify and redeem the world. What we can have is a story about, okay, maybe we can imagine if nature is aimed at this sort of like great health, or nature is always creating stronger, more complex, more beautiful forms. What is the limit of the strongest? What would pure health look like? And using that as a sort of what would a human being look like if he was completely free of ressentiment and the bad conscience? What would a human being be like if he was completely free from viewing power from the side of reactivity and pettiness? What would a human being be like if he didn't have any recourse to any metaphysical comforts? If he didn't think in any of these moral Platonic terms? If he understood things like grammar and the laws of logic as part of this world of mere appearance rather than uh, circumscriptions on the way he has to think about the world, which is what they are. I mean, the real world, all of these like Platonic categories of thought are completely made up, right? It truly is a flux. One does not step into the same river twice. I really truly believe that. And, you know, yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to go into a exegesis of Heraclitus here, but the so the overman is just that. It's something to renounce to, or to sacrifice for, to renounce on behalf of an ideal of what mankind could become. So a physical limit of goodness rather than a metaphysical limit of goodness. The metaphysical limit case of goodness, or the ultimate limit of, or unlimited goodness, we might say, because this has also its own course of development. You have Plato's good coming from the Greek the one, and eventually in the early Christian fathers that is God, right? And so the overman is a materialist God that is ultimate goodness in a physical form. And the reason why man is a bridge and not a goal is because all of us are, should see ourselves like the meaning of this cycle, of this eternal recurrence of war and peace, life and death, birth and rebirth, if you want to get Buddhist about it, is that we're bringing forth the overman. We are bringing forth stronger, beautiful, more healthy forms of life. And so what does Nietzsche tell the rope dancer as he dies to console him? He says, you have lived your life in pursuit of danger, and there's something great and admirable about that. You have perished attempting the great and the impossible. There's nothing better than that. You should build your temples on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. You should live dangerously. You should live according to the adage that comes out of the military school of life. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. Not because you actually are invincible and you will, but that you should have that attitude, right? That should be the attitude. Because, again, as the old wisdom goes, old age will not give you a truce even if you avoid the sword and the spear. So there's no point in trying to preserve your life. So you should instead think, what kind of story is my life living? Am I aiming at that greatness? Am I willing to be the tragic hero who is sacrificed? So, yeah. Okay, another one. Question. I noticed some Nietzsche followers, as in quotes, become very preachy about not doing moral judgments, criticizing those who do. Is this what happens when a priestly type reads Nietzsche? I mean, yeah, that might be it. There is something very funny about being an immoralist moralist. But it might not even be that they are a priestly type, right? It's just that, again, that whole structure of our thought is so ingrained into us. that it's very hard to find. I mean, you throw a stone and you hit a person who thinks like a Platonist or a Christian, because that's um, in a way that's very natural. It's, I would even say, and I think you can get this out of Nietzsche, although he doesn't say it as explicitly. I mean, the genius of the species passage is one place where you could potentially glean this notion, but that consciousness itself, in many ways, like inclines toward this kind of Platonism. What does that mean? Well, if consciousness is only useful as a net of communication between human beings, because as Nietzsche points out, an animal that lives as a solitary beast of prey, like a wild cat, would not need to develop consciousness to the degree that we have it. Now, we could argue about what degree they actually have consciousness, right? But his argument is that the usefulness of consciousness is in being able to coordinate, which means communicate, right? And there's some degree of anthropology that bears this out, that the evolutionary advantage granted to human beings by consciousness is primarily our ability to all throw projectiles at the same thing and coordinate our mass throwing of projectiles in order to take down like large predators, right? So there is like anthropological truth to that. But so Nietzsche's, you know, what would we say? I don't know. I lost my train of thought there. Point is, consciousness, communication, language. So if consciousness exists for the purpose of communication, and language, therefore, we would expect to be sort of, if it's the raison d'etre of consciousness, is language, communication in some form. And then when we look at how language operates, it's Platonic. You take, and what do I mean by that? It's like you have an ideal of something. Rousseau makes this point in the Discourse on Inequality. I think it's in the context of trying to make some point about how the savage's mind works versus ours, but I don't remember exactly. But Rousseau makes this point that when you think of the word tree cannot designate a specific tree, or even a specific kind of tree, or even like it can't designate anything specific about it. Words sort of attain their capital by including many things within general categories. And what Nietzsche would say about that is that what you're doing is making the unequal equal. Another passage is that without constant falsification of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. And so, and there's a passage in Human All Too Human where he says every like mathematical or numerical designation assumes the equality of unequal things. So, in other words, all the different kinds of trees are not like equal in any sense, or they're not the same type of phenomenon. That's like a conceptual category that we've created for our own purposes. And the way people normally argue against that is usually like, usually by appealing to the practical usage and incredible power of these conceptual categories. And Nietzsche doesn't dispute that, and I certainly wouldn't either, right? That is the way that we, at the very least, conceptualize and communicate about the world. Even if it isn't necessarily, I would agree with Nietzsche as well, how we always experience the world. But it is how we conceptualize it and communicate about it, is by treating these general categories as real. And when you do that, you're not being a Heraclitean, you're being a Platonist, right? You're assuming the form of the tree, of which all the individual trees are just sort of approximations or instantiations. And so even after Aristotle, who I think is a vast improvement over Plato, I think there is something to the Nietzschean idea that we are just stuck within these Platonic modes of thought, that we think of these conceptual categories as real in some way. And that's why idealism is so, it's just like this inescapable pitfall of our thought, and that it takes like a real struggle to overcome idealism. So, maybe they're not priestly types. They've just been educated by priests their whole life, Somebody says, and I'm going to take two more questions, or we'll say three, and then I'll end the stream. Somebody says, would you say that slave morality Wait, sorry. There was another one I saw earlier. It's about Lord of the Rings. No, there's actually way more questions. Oh, wow. Okay. I was like way behind. Okay, I'll try and answer all these. I'll try and be like a little bit quicker with my answers. Why do you still like Lord of the Rings if it tells a story about a world based on love instead of power? Because how do I put this? Um, I actually don't think that will to power necessarily explains motivations out of love. And I know that might be controversial among Nietzscheans, but um, you know, I think that's one of the biggest blind spots of Nietzsche, and I think it might have to do with the fact that he didn't have a family and he didn't feel close to his family. Um, but I think that he understood it to some extent of like what love is. There's that famous aphorism: whatever is done out of love happens necessarily beyond good and evil, or occurs necessarily beyond good and evil. But he sees love as like a tyrannical impulse, which I think it largely is when it comes to romantic love. But there is something beyond that he might have experienced if he had like um, you know, been married or had children. I don't know. I just and you can interpret that as like will to power still being the basis of that. But I think it is like, okay, so this will be like my attempt to like summarize basically my feelings on it. I think because we have like love for our friends and family and romantic partners, so on and so forth, we really want to that I think that a lot of that is the origin of these like Christian stories about like uh metaphysical like other worlds and redemption and suffering and like from suffering and living forever and all of these things. Like in many ways, I think it's like a beautiful so Lord of the Rings is an expression of that, right? Lord of the Rings is an expression of this speaking for this impulse within us to essentially falsify the world, lie about what the world is, because that will appear more beautiful to us and maybe seduce us to go on living. So there's like kind of a way you can say it's still will to power, but to me that's not as interesting as just you know one of the lines in my book is that art is at the forefront of our war on reality. And I think most of our artistic and intellectual pursuits does take the form of being at war with what the reality is. And I think there's something beautiful about that because of the very fact that it's somebody willing to fight a losing battle. Because your art will never change the nature of reality. But it's so there's very romantic in that way. And that's maybe what I love about Lord of the Rings is like it's this like romantic vision of the world, and there's something very endearing about that. And I think that there have been people who have made great self-sacrifices out of love. And you can say from a Nietzschean perspective, like, well, that was dumb or whatever. But I get that. Like, also, you could look at it from the other angle and say, well, that was their will to power. That was the illusion that seduced them to life and made them willing to sacrifice for something beyond themselves. And so, and I think why Lord of the Rings? Well, just because it's one of the greatest stories ever told, if not like one of the best, or if not like the best in cinematic form. I would say Lord of the Rings was like the peak of cinema. Um, Star Wars doesn't even hold a candle to it, the original Star Wars trilogy. Um, and I'll fight anyone about that. Physically, I'll fight them. How have you found philosophy, and how have you been ripped apart by the Minotaur of conscience? I kind of talked about that earlier. And found philosophy reading on tour. Again, this is something I've talked a lot about in Q&As. Minotaur of conscience. That's a very personal question. I'm not going to talk about it. Okay. Let's see here. What episodes of your podcast do you think were your best? I mean, my favorite is the Journey to Hades, the one that I just did, and that's sort of a typical move to say the thing you just worked on is your favorite thing. But that was an episode I wanted to do for a very long time, and it was the kind of episode I could only do. I felt once I'd already talked about each of the thinkers that Nietzsche mentions in that aphorism on their own, And then once you're familiar with all of them, then we can kind of go back and then like look and place them in relationship to each other. It was just my favorite because it took so much preparation to get there. And in a way, the whole 3 years of the show up to this point was leading up to that episode. And it's not like one of the most well-known aphorisms, but it's just so uh, I don't know. To me, it's so fascinating and like really understanding like at that point, at the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophical career, he tells you like these are the eight like most important people, the ones who I accept judgment from and will allow to pass judgment on one another. So yeah, that's probably my favorite. I mean, as for others, I think the a lot of the ones that actually performed the best did pretty well. I really like the Spinoza episode too, and the philosophy and the tragic age of the Greeks episodes as well, because I love the subject matter a lot. Jimothy, I already answered one of your questions, so I'm gonna try and get in somebody else's. Um, it seems to be the same people asking questions, so I'm gonna try and find a new person. Non-philosophical question: can you show off your bookshelf? Did you say you were in a new band? Do musicians live what you mentioned, live an active life? How do you go about writing? Well, that's like 4 questions. So I'm gonna answer these, and then we're gonna be done with the stream. So, and sorry to anyone whose question I didn't get to or didn't answer. There are a lot of people here, but so thank you everybody for coming. But so let's see here. Showing off my bookshelf. So there's actually a Reddit post from a long time ago where I showed off my bookshelf. This is not even back here. This is not my main bookshelf. This is the bookshelf in my like little office studio. I have like a main bookshelf out there, and then things kind of move according to like this is generally the stuff that I'm working on like right now. But then also like I just have like stacks and stacks of books, you know. Well, there's only like 2 of them, but I just have all these books sitting around me. And because, I'll take out a book and I'm like reading it and making notes and working on a script, and then I set it down, and then, I'll just have multiples out at the same time. So, yeah. My new band is called Slumbering Sun. It's not a new band. I've been in that band for like the past 1.5, 2 years, but that's the newer band because the old band I was in for like 12 years. So, and that's coming to an end at the end of the month. So, that band only has 1 album. I feel way more enthused about that band than anything else I've ever worked on. And then someone says, or then the same person asks, do musicians live what you mentioned, live an active life? It depends. A lot of them don't. A lot of them are concerned with how they will be perceived, because of course they are, But the core of art is always the desire to express something. This is also why I suspect there's like something that's not quite encapsulated by will to power, because the artistic desire to have communion, and I mean that in like a religious sense of like touching another human soul, I don't think can be understood necessarily in terms of wanting to dominate or overcome them, that they're like an obstacle to overcome. Because that's how Nietzsche defines power, or he defines what is good in that aphorism of the Antichrist we looked at the very beginning of the stream. That the feeling of pleasure is the feeling that resistance is being overcome. And I know exactly what he means by that. And it does apply to art, because you'll struggle with a project and feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall, and then you kind of have a breakthrough, right? So I get it. But the actual like artistic communion of where I don't know. It's hard to tease all these feelings out, because like I've played to an audience of thousands, and there is a feeling of power, but there's something more than that, of like wanting them to feel what you feel, and not just because you're like trying to like impose something on them. Nietzsche talks about this in Twilight of Idols. He says that every artist has to have like an ecstasy he wants to share with the world out of abundant over fullness or something like that. But he does put it in the language of like wanting to impose on other people. And I think it is, maybe Nietzsche sees this other side of life when he makes his remarks about sort of like generosity and overfullness. That to me is more of the vibe, like wanting to share. And maybe again, you can see the way in which that makes you feel powerful. but it's I don't know. I think that is it's not all that's going on there, and I don't know if I really have like a good argument or like I don't have any proof of that. I'm just saying I feel like there is something like, yeah, Nietzsche does not completely understand perfectly every last aspect of human nature, and there are things that he might have missed based on his perspective and the kind of life he led. And that method that Nietzsche teaches us to evaluate thinkers based on those things, we should certainly apply to Nietzsche, right? When he's writing about like Epicurus and saying like maybe this garden god, this recluse wrote his hundreds of books just out of spite and resentment towards Plato, right? It's pretty, cool takedown, Nietzsche. You know, you can apply similar critiques to Nietzsche too, though. Absolutely, you can. And I think Nietzsche would have expected that. So, do musicians live an active life? I mean, some of them do, to the extent they're driven by true art, truly just wanting to share of themselves with the world. Then yes, but there's so much in the arts that is involved with fundamentally reactive and petty concerns, and your representation and perception of yourself, and I get sucked into it too, and it's all so tiresome. So it's not what I like about the arts. And then how do I go about writing? Well, to me, it comes very naturally. So yeah. Okay. All right, everybody. I think we're gonna call it here. My voice is getting a little tired, and I've had fun. I hope everyone else had fun. I hope that we're not. I hope that we can stand as a community for the spirit of having fun, and I mean that in a profound sense of like getting enjoyment and enrichment out of philosophy and ideas and books and literature, and that's a large part of what the podcast stands for, and that we're not out there collecting books to have on our bookshelf just to have like a symbol or representation of authority or power or something like that. So thank you, everyone. Oh, also another thing, really quick note before I leave. There is, you can find a video in my channel if you want to see me show off my Skyrim bookcase. I collected every single book in the game, with the first like expansions or whatever included. And I put up a video where I tore my whole library and I indexed it too. And they're arranged on shelf according to topic. So, that's not, my real bookshelf, but I can post that too. I'll post that on YouTube, that old Reddit post of like, I'll find that picture of my old bookshelf. Oh, and somebody says, what is his band? Let me give a listen. The band, Slumbering Sun. It's melodic doom metal. Some people have said it's emo doom. I don't really know what that means, but yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully, I made sense at all points and didn't ramble too much. Alrighty. Take it easy, y'all. Bye.